All right, it is officially time for the Beatles ranked video. In today's video, I'm going to be ranking all 12 of the Beatles studio albums. If you guys have been living under a rock or just maybe you haven't checked the channel in a while, I've been doing a lot of Beatles reactions. I went through and listened to every single album once again, so I do have pretty up-to-date, recent thoughts and opinions on these albums. So yeah, let's get into it. The Beatles, worst to best.
Wait, oh yes, wait a minute, Mr. Postman.
Coming in last place here is With the Beatles. This came out in 1963. This was their second album, and to me, this completely loses the charm of their first album. It feels a lot more calculated and not as raw or authentic as that album. You do occasionally get some funny and memorable songwriting here, but for the most part, every track melds together to create an underwhelming experience. The best compliment I can give this is that it's kind of easy listening. You can put this on in the background and it works. It's catchy and straight to the point. But as is the case with some of their other early albums, it doesn't really stand the test of time. Was this slightly different from much of the mainstream stuff at the time? Sure, but in 2025, it's really something I can live without.
Hold me close and tell me how you feel.
At number 11, I have Beatles for Sale. This came out in 1964. This was their fourth album, the follow-up to A Hard Day's Night. And much like With the Beatles, this album suffers from formulaic 2-minute tracks that were a result of the conditions to get on the radio at the time, where songs had to be a certain length, and that was often under 3 minutes. This album starts off pretty strong, but quickly divulges into a soulless and uninspired album that feels like a disappointing follow-up to A Hard Day's Night, an album that I quite enjoyed. It's also important to mention that this album was apparently extremely rushed, which you can definitely hear, especially in the musical performances, which often lack energy and guitar solos that are underwhelming, to say the least. The biggest sin that these early albums often commit is the lack of variety. The music here isn't necessarily bad, but it's just not offering nearly enough exciting or different ideas to keep me invested.
Anna, girl, before you go now.
At number 10, I have Please Please Me. This is the Beatles' debut album from 1963. Now, I loved this album on a first listen, and I will be honest, the novelty has worn off on me a little bit. When I first heard it, it was just really interesting to hear the Beatles make this kind of music. It felt really innocent and sweet to hear them making this kind of kitschy and formulaic love tracks that really couldn't be more different from their later albums. But as I return to it, that novelty has just kind of worn off, and it really doesn't stand up to their best work. Still though, there's an authenticity and a simplicity to this album that I really enjoy. The melodies are extremely singable. Apparently this album was recorded in only a day, and you really hear that come through in how spontaneous this album feels. The instrumental performances aren't perfect, everything isn't super thought out, it's just some solid performances and covers. I have somewhat of a soft spot for albums that feel very representative of their time period. Think of I Got a Feelin' by the Black Eyed Peas, okay? If that track doesn't perfectly represent early 2010s EDM kind of club pop music, then I don't know what does. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. This album is basically the Black Eyed Peas of the 60s.
Let it be, let it be, let it be, let it be.
At number 9, I have Let It Be. This came out in 1970, and my first impression of this album was a pretty negative one, and that was the cover art. It feels like this cover art strips all the creativity and personality that the last few albums were building, instead opting for a very basic depiction of the 4 members. And I'd be wrong to say that this didn't paint this album in a very negative light before I'd even listened to it. However, the music here, it's pretty solid. The sound of this album is rather tame in comparison to the wild and experimental stuff they were recording at this time. It does have one of the worst Beatles songs ever, Dig a Pony, a track that has a horribly annoying vocal performance and a messy instrumental performance from the band. But then that's immediately followed up by one of their best tracks, Across the Universe, and that pretty much sums up this whole album. It's a mixed bag. There's some extremely high highs, but some extremely low lows.
I don't know how.
At number 8, I have the White Album. or I guess The Beatles Self-Titled from 1968. Simply put, this has some of their most experimental tracks. While this album is messy and chaotic, I feel like Revolution 9, the concluding track, does as much as it can to somewhat save this all-over-the-place track list. It paints the messiness as kind of the point or the theme of the album. While this album doesn't feel as polished of a final product as some of their best work, there are some fantastic singular tracks that really stop me from putting it any lower. It's also a great display of the band's range, from more traditional rockers to psychedelic Led Zeppelin adjacent tracks to the warbly shot of experimentation that is Wild Honey Pie. There's just a lot more singular moments that I can point to and say that I've never heard anything like it before.
Anytime at all. Anytime at all.
At number 7, I have A Hard Day's Night from 1964. This is the Beatles' third album and their first album of solely original songs. I feel like they really started to find their own identity here, both sonically and lyrically. You really start to hear the Bob Dylan influence with the harmonicas and the more personal and introspective lyricism. And this also does a great job of blending the kitschy love tracks with more sophisticated songwriting. While With the Beatles and Beatles for Sale attempted this balancing act, this is the first album that I think is actually successful at it, and it's their first album that I think truly stands the test of time. All right, we're getting into stuff here that I think is actually like great. I think these are great albums. The stuff before, kind of some mixed bags. I think Hard Day's Night is pretty good, but now we're getting into the good stuff, okay?
Big and black the clouds may be, time will pass away.
At number 6, I have Help. This came out in 1965. This was the Beatles' 5th album, the one right before Rubber Soul. And to me, this is easily their best album out of the first 5. This album is much more thought out and fully developed in comparison to the rush job that was Beatles for Sale. This is probably also their most country and folk-leaning album, which was a sound that they explored on previous albums, but not as intensely as they did on this one. Overall, I just love the amount of variety here and how much heart and soul was put into each track. The mixes also start to feel a bit more thick here. While it's still produced with a lot of hard panning of instruments left and right, these mixes definitely fill the headphones. And this is probably their first album where I can straight up point to the production by George Martin as something special. In the previous albums, it felt like the production was just kind of falling into the background, but here it really grabs a hold and makes its presence known. Like the drunk-sounding guitar on I Need You, or the strangely satisfying instrumental break on Tell Me What You See. The writing also takes more of a dark turn here. Where previous albums were hopelessly in love and highlighting that yearning for love, the writing here more so feels like the Beatles saying, I love you so much, and it might kill me if I don't have it. And that's kind of a lyrical and conceptual angle that feels overdone in today's music, but that wasn't really the case with popular music in the 60s. All right, we're moving to the top 5 here. I don't think this top 5 is really that surprising. I think this is probably most people's top 5, but I did have a tough time kind of figuring out the order of this top 5 because I love all these albums. I think all of these albums are like classics, but at 5 here, I have Rubber Soul.
Say the word, you'll be free.
This is the first album that I reacted to on this channel, and I feel like I didn't fully appreciate this album on a first listen. I liked it, but I thought it was relatively straightforward, and it wasn't as experimental as I thought it would be. However, with their entire discography in view, this is truly a stunning album. I feel like the writing here is starting to have a lot more fun, like the beep beeps on Drive My Car, for example, while also feeling much more imagery and symbolism heavy. Unlike some of their earlier albums, there's a wide range of song concepts here. They're not just all about love. I love the lyrics on Nowhere Man specifically. It's a concept that I relate to a lot, and it's a feeling that I've had a lot, but I haven't really been able to describe or put into words. And that's what the Beatles did with this track. This is also their first album that features the sitar, an instrument that they would go on to use on many later albums. This points towards a trend of the Beatles starting to use a lot more diverse palettes of instruments on their later albums. This album also starts to play with more interesting vocal harmonies and more dissonance. With all that said though, I really appreciate the simplicity of this album. It's not their most instrumentally lush album, but each instrumental element on each track feels so purposeful and has so much character to it.
Strawberry fields.
At number 4, I have Magical Mystery Tour from 1967. This feels kind of like, I guess, the sequel to Sgt. Pepper's. Just a crazy, diverse soundscape to this album. There's lots of horns and woodwinds, really in-depth sound design, and like I said, it feels like it continues that psychedelia of Sgt. Pepper's forward, maybe like the dark aftermath of the LSD trip that is Sgt. Pepper's. There's lots of distortion, phasers, left and right panning, a wide range of instrumental textures, reversed vocal chops, and it's just an album that's really easy to get lost in and float along to. The pace of these tracks are often extremely slow, with the woozy vocal overdubs and sliding strings. This album often feels like the sonic equivalent to a syrupy substance that temporarily alters your brain chemistry, which I guess is just a convoluted way of saying drugs. Yeah. This album is the sonic representation of drugs, and I think it's actually more of a visceral representation of that than Sgt. Pepper's. But they do somehow miraculously manage to still craft really catchy and tight pop songs within this drugged-out context, like Hello Goodbye, for example. Overall, this doesn't feel as thematically cohesive as their best albums, but it's still a memorable moment in their discography. All right, we're moving into the top 3 here, and like I said, the top 5 was really hard to figure out the order, but like specifically the top 3 was super difficult. Any of these top 3 albums could have landed at number 1. But yeah, we're gonna get into number 3 here. Number 3, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band from 1967. While this album is pinned as the Beatles' crazy drug-induced experience, I mean, there's literally a song title that stands for LSD, so I guess it kind of is. But personally, I find Magical Mystery Tour to actually be the more trippy album. That isn't to say that Magical Mystery Tour is better, though. While this album might not feel as psychedelic, I think there is a more cohesive track list, and I think this has the more impressive songwriting. This might sound like a dumb thing to say, too, but this feels like their coolest album. Like, there's a level of swag here that the band reaches that is just so likable, and it's so far removed from what they were doing on their first albums. I have to specifically mention She's Leaving Home. It's one of the few Beatles tracks that has made me cry. There's something so beautiful about the strings on this track, the angelic and soaring vocals on the chorus, and the beautifully thoughtful and heartfelt portrayal of a girl yearning to get away from the mundanity of her current life. I think that's a word. Hopefully that's a word. And of course, Day in the Life is just one of the greatest songs of all time, with its iconic opening melody and unconventional structure. It has this indescribable quality to it that just leaves me mind blown every time I hear it. This album is so ahead of its time, it just blows my mind. Like, the production, textures, and songwriting is unbelievable, not only for 1967, but it still feels boundary pushing over 50 years later. All right, at number 2, I have Abbey Road from 1969. Maybe their most popular album. I mean, it has Here Comes the Sun. That album, or that song, is absolutely massive. But yeah, I love this thing. I think this is definitely their most well-produced album. The bass lines sound so good on this album. They're so thick. The guitar tones meld together in such a complimentary way. In general, it feels like the most intentional and pristine production on any Beatles album, and it's this production that makes this album sound like they're most modern. A lot of the guitar tones here remind me of Pink Floyd, particularly on the tracks I Want You, She's So Heavy, and Sun King. I'm not totally sure who influenced who, and to be honest, I don't really care. I think it's just noteworthy to point out that somewhat psychedelic turn this album takes at times. While previous albums went psychedelic, it never directly felt reminiscent of Pink Floyd as it does on this album. This album's track list is also noteworthy to mention. It's front-loaded with a lot of longer songs, and then suddenly switches to a bunch of fast-paced short tracks that transition into each other seamlessly. It makes for a really exciting second half of the album, and it's really the only Beatles album that feels this intentional with the order of the track list. I don't have as strong of an emotional connection to this album as I do with some of their other albums, but the songwriting, performances, and production on this is undeniable. Are you guys ready for this? I mean, you gotta know what number 1 is, because process of elimination, right? But here we go. Here's my favorite Beatles album. Making each day of the year. At number 1, it's Revolver from 1966, the follow-up to Rubber Soul, the second reaction that I did on this channel, and I think the first Beatles album that I had a really strong emotional connection to. I think this has the band's best songwriting, period. Some of my favorite moments include the guitar riff and vocal hook on She Said, the guitar solo on And Your Bird Can Sing, and the vocal melodies on For No One. Listing all these fantastic singular moments is making me realize why I love this album so much. It has the best and most memorable vocal performances of any Beatles album, and I truly believe the voice is the heart and soul of their music. I'm also just a simple man. If an album is extremely singable, I'm probably gonna love it. And that's exactly what this album is. Every song offers some sort of vocal melody that just nestles itself into my brain, and I find myself singing random melodies from this album even when I haven't listened to it in a long time. This is also where they really started to experiment with psychedelic production elements, like the reversed guitar on I'm Only Sleeping, or pretty much the entirety of Tomorrow Never Knows. These psychedelic moments are really tastefully integrated, though. The album never relies on these sounds. The songs are well crafted at their core, and these psychedelic moments and sounds just enhance these already fantastic songs. The production and mixing here does sound kind of rudimentary compared to Abbey Road, but that's what makes it stand out to me. It still has the charm that a lot of old music has that makes it feel like I'm listening to something from a different world, and a lot of that can be attributed to the hard right and left panning of instruments, but it's the fact that it's presenting such interesting and groundbreaking ideas within this traditional context that makes it so special. And there you go. That is the Beatles ranked video. Yeah, I think I'm happy with this list. I think I'm happy. Like, who knows? Maybe in a couple months from now, I could see my top 3 changing probably, but I think the top 5 is pretty set in stone. I think like the bottom 6 is probably pretty set in stone as well. And that's kind of the end to the Beatles saga on this channel. Now, I still need to do All Things Must Pass by George Harrison, which I'll do at some point, but I'm going to be going back into doing some more current music that's coming out. Black Country New Road just dropped a new album that I need to listen to. Overall, I just kind of want to talk about the Beatles' journey in general. I had a really good time with this music. Like, maybe not every album was mind-blowing, and there was some mid stuff towards the beginning, I'll be honest. And maybe sometimes when I'm reading the comments, I get a little bit frustrated because there's a generational gap between me and the majority of people watching these videos. But I think I've always been someone who wants to appreciate music from like every era, I guess. I think there's good music in whatever time period you're looking at, right? And sometimes the old heads might lead you to believe that there's no good music coming out today, but that's absolutely not the case. There's good music in every time period. I feel like it was really important for me as a music fan to go back into this discography and really understand what the Beatles were doing, because you see so much of their influence in music today that I feel like it's actually a necessity to go back and listen to their albums. And as I was preparing for this Beatles ranked video, I honestly gained even more of an appreciation for these albums. Like, after I did the first reactions, I was like, I don't really know if I'm going to return to the Beatles that much. But after I re-listened to every single album once again, it really like made it clear to me that, you know, I'm going to be spinning these albums a lot. Like, specifically Revolver, Abbey Road, and Sgt. Pepper's, those top 3. I'm going to come back to these a lot. And I didn't think that was going to be the case when I was doing the first reactions. So I feel like I've grown like a genuine appreciation for the music. So yeah, those are my thoughts on the Beatles. That's my Beatles ranked video. Let me know your thoughts and opinions down below. There's probably gonna be lots of angry people, maybe. I don't know. I feel like maybe the top 5 is pretty unanimous, pretty consensus. Most people agree on that, but let me know your thoughts. Love reading the comments down below. And if you enjoyed, leave a like, subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next one. Peace out.